Friends, we will start maybe in about a couple of minutes. Let's see if several more colleagues come in and fill up the room a little bit more. So maybe in a couple more minutes, and then that will also give our panelists some time to settle down a bit, catch their breath, and prepare for what I think we all hope and expect to be a very engaging and fruitful and enriching conversation. Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues, friends, and welcome to this side event. I'm Vicente Yu. I'm a senior legal advisor at the Third World Network, an international NGO based in Malaysia. And I've had the privilege and the pleasure of actually being one of the, I think, few people here in Geneva to have had negotiated on the trenches of the climate change convention process. And that's why I thought it would be extremely interesting for us, all of us to be here and to listen from the human rights perspective, how what we should be doing in the context of climate change. And I think all of us have seen the videos, have seen the images of what has happened recently in the United States with Hurricane Helen. That is something that for me, for example, coming from the Philippines, we see on an annual basis. Colleagues from the Pacific also see those kinds of hurricanes, typhoons, not just once a year, but multiple times a year. We are also seeing other extreme weather events, slow onset events caused by climate change across many other parts of the world, in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia. And I think one of these issues is then the impact that those climate change events have had on human rights and what can be done by states with respect to the harm that has been caused because of climate change. And we have had a report by the UN Secretary General with respect to the entitlements to remedies and reparations. We have had the Special Rapporteur and Right to Development's latest report as well, which you will hear a presentation from in the course of this panel. And so we hope that this side event and the speakers that we have been able to put together will be able to advance the discourse. Just a few housekeeping notes. One is that the photos and videos of this event can only be done by the organizers. Second, for those of you who have friends and relatives and other interested people who are outside of this room, please do tell them that this is also being live streamed, and the live stream link can be found online on CIAL's website and GECO's website. We will also have coffee and some snacks after the event. I have the pleasure also of informing you that this event is organized by the Center for International Environmental Law and GECO, and has been supported by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as well. And we would like to thank them very much for that. We have 5 speakers this afternoon who will be able to present us with different perspectives in terms of how we deal with that issue of remedy for climate change, human rights harm. We have Mr. Ray Bainteti on my left, far left, from the Banaban Human Rights Defenders Network. Ambassador Sumbwe Antas, of course, from Vanuatu, who will talk to us about the role of the ICJ in clarifying legal obligations. We will have a presentation from Professor Surya Deva, the Special Rapporteur on the right to development. On my right as well is Ms. Rina Kusipalo from the OHCHR. And last but not least, my colleague Lian Van Dam from the Center for International Environmental Law. So with that, after the idea here is then we go through the panelists in sequence, and then we will open up for question and answer after all of the presentations are done. So maybe with that, let me go and ask Ray first to kick us off. Ray?
Thank you so much, moderator. Just before I start this presentation, I greet you all in my mother tongue, Dabotata, Maori, Ulavinak, and warm Pacific greetings to everyone that's here in the room. Our bodies are like islands. They are sites of colonial violence and powerful resistance. We are part of an eternal energy interconnected with past, present, and future. This is one of my favorite quotes from one of Banaban professor, academic, as well as an activist, who has sadly demised, but many of her writings, wisdoms of practice have been something to live by her words, and I honor her, although she's not here anymore. But like Teresia Tewa, there were many ancestors before us that took on resistance work because of our history, and I would like to get into my presentation now to show you somewhat a complex situation, but we always believe that environment degradation has always been the common factor between any form of disasters, whether it be from climate change, militarism, or extractive industries. So my name is Isinterunga. My first name is Isinterunga. It was the name given to me by my grandfather from my mom's side, because it's a name to keep my connections to the Cruzarian Banabans who were dispersed from Banaban in 1945. I grew up in Rambi, and my second name, Ray, is adopted from Cyclone Ray of 1990, because I was born in the middle of cyclone. It was a gift by the nurses who were at the station for the bravery of my mom who delivered me that night. But my dad's name is Bengteis, and as you could see, I come from a very large family. And on the top left are team members of the Banaban Human Rights Defenders Network, and we are based and we work in Rambi. And just in this room, I also honor some of our people who are here. Erin from my camp, who's sitting in the room, for the many partnership and work that has led us here. Now, where is Banaban? So Banaban was discovered in 1804 by a vessel named called Ocean. So it was previously called Ocean Island. In 1877, the British engaged, but only in 1900 when phosphate, not just any phosphate, A-grade phosphate was discovered on this island. And it was in 1915 that a lot of interest took place to annex the island to be part of the protectorate to what was called the Gilbert Islands and Ellis Islands. So from Tarawa, the main capital of the modern day Kiribati, it takes about 2 nights to get to Banaban. But from Nauru, it takes about less than 300 kilometers to get to Banaban. Mining ceased in 1979, but it resulted in so many things, including one, stripping away of 22 million tons of ancestral lands to contribute to the development of agricultural sectors from the main stakeholder countries, including Australia, the UK, and New Zealand. And from an elevation of about 90 meters above sea level, land was crossed to about barely 20 meters above sea level, and 80 to 90% of the land surface was taken away. So what we are left with on this island is just maybe 20% of land surface where the BBC, or the British Phosphate company that was mining the island for 80 years since 1900, used to build houses. The forced relocation of Barnabans took place in 1945, 15 December, from Barnaba and Kiribati, 2,000 kilometers to Fiji, an island we bought in 1945. And you can see it depicted on that map. It was a long journey for our elders. The transition to the new island was somewhat very difficult for our elders, given the new environment. They traveled during a cyclone season to get to their new homeland. Promises of homes, promises of schools, education, other well-being support services were not available, and they were given 2 weeks of rationing to transit into their new island home. So that is just a photo of an example of the extraction that took place on Barnaba. And aside from the three main stakeholder countries, through the research of Professor Katarina Tewa, who's also Barnaban by heritage, she also went through an archival search and actually traced where our land to. And this is because land is very important to any Pacific Islanders. And like the Barnabans, you can never talk about the injustice that happened on Barnaba without looking at the land and where it went. Because in the process of mining our land, they took bones, they took everything that was in their way. And it was important for us to understand where these lands ended up. And as you can see, it went. And our people were already moving within the Pacific Island countries. In the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, our people have been resisting, mobilizing with the communities to talk about the injustice that happened on Barnaba. Just most recently, we've started this campaign, started talking about the injustice because it disappeared with time in history. No one has looked into these dark histories of extractive industries. And I will try and make some connections how this is very relevant to climate change now. Because on Barnaba, there's a lot of water crisis that has been happening. For 80 years, we've never been able to fix the water crisis that's been prolonged. Is a long-standing issue on our island. And it's been documented on the media. We've been talking, we've exhausted almost every national processes and looking far beyond how we can solve and get permanent solutions for the ongoing water crisis. On Rambi, where I grew up in Fiji, is the same issues all over. Not just water crisis, we are also challenged with food insecurity. And basically, because when the mining happened, it destroyed our waterlands, destroyed the land where you can plant traditional crops, and it also uprooted us, losing our connection to our culture and heritage. And I've always said, through the Barnaban lessons learned from our migration and the injustice that were caused on our community, there is no climate justice without the Barnaban justice. This is Rambi, where I grew up. And as you can see, this is just a short, and we will not do justice to what's happening on the island because soil erosion is right throughout the island. That's just a snapshot, a good photo, but you could see the extent of the beach that has been eroded. Climate change has been the biggest challenge both on both islands. On Barnaba, because of the extraction that happened, we could no longer fetch our water from our rooftop because of the poisonous asbestos, or however you pronounce it, and you can never catch water. Before, the mining company used to ship in water from Melbourne. But then this year, last year, September, the remining has resurfaced again. It's the same companies coming back to remind the island. I mean, what's left on the island is merely 20% of the land surface. And yet we have a lot of interest to come back and remind. And it's a bit worrying because as a fourth generation Barnaban living in Rambi, the disconnection to our ancestral home resulting from the forced relocation has kind of led the younger generation to think that maybe, yes, that's a good way to bring the development to our island because we're no longer living in Barnaban. We are all living in Fiji. So I'd like to talk, I've got two more slides, sorry for that. But I'd like to talk on the second last one, which is the challenges when it comes to categorizing environmental degradation and climate impacts. And like I said, we cannot talk about climate justice without factoring in environmental degradation resulting from extractive industries and militarism. And we know this from our own Banaban stories. You know, extractive industries and militarism cause environmental degradation and contribute vast amount of carbon dioxide, making impacts more greater for Pacific communities in the Pacific, whose coral atoll nations are merely just 2 meters or 3 meters above sea level. And our people have felt this interconnectedness. Imagine a land that has been stripped off. Imagine a land that can no longer support life on the island of the indigenous people of Banaban, and then adding on that impact is climate change, where we are constantly receiving a lot of drought lately, creating more impacts on our people, making them more vulnerable. Now, what we can learn from reparations, the Banabans are well known for being the longest court case ever in the history of UK, and you can cite that documentary called "Take It to the Judge," go tell it to the judge. But we've been we've been for almost 80 years. We've been fighting for reparations from countries that were responsible for first the forced relocation, second the forced relocation, but the first one was the extraction that happened on Banaban with little success. So when you factor in any form of reparation, regardless of what the nature that triggered these environment degradation, for 80 years we've tried, and for 80 years we've not been very successful. So you can imagine, you know, how hard it is for communities that merely contribute to the climate crisis, can fight for reparation forever, but it will take 80 years to be where we're at, and we do not know how many more years it will take them to finally get this reparation for loss and damage on our culture and heritage. I thank you, moderator.
Thank you, Ray, and that was just exactly on time. Thank you for that and for giving us a glimpse of the struggles that the Banaban people have had in terms of making sure that you get your rights addressed and protected. I found it particularly interesting the fact that much of the land went to only a few countries that have benefited from the extraction of that land. Let me then go to Ambassador Antas, please, who will provide us with some insights on the role of the ICJ to clarify legal obligations regarding climate reparations. As you know, Vanuatu has been in the driver's seat, right, Ambassador, in terms of getting the UN General Assembly to agree to a resolution to ask the ICJ for an advisory opinion. And Vanuatu has also been a key state in terms of getting a large number of countries from all over the world to provide comments and national submissions in that regard. So, Ambassador, please. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, moderator. And good afternoon, everyone. Everyone is smiling. But I would like to start by saying this. At the Leaders Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Summit, which was held in August on the island of Tonga in the South Pacific, the leaders made a statement to say, well, in the communique, they stated that climate change continues to be a matter of priority for the Pacific region, and relatedly, the issue of resilient development, unquote. So at the regional level, we still speak of the issue of climate change. And of course, the reference to Vanuatu's leading the discussions at the New York to ensure we get a resolution to refer the question of the issue of climate change responsibility states to the ICJ. Of course, was led by Vanuatu, but it was a whole global effort. Everybody supported the initiative. So I thank the world for thinking about this issue as an issue of humanity that must be addressed. Now the question then is being asked here, what are the climate reparations and ICJs and the loss and damage and the human rights? So let's start off the question as we have raised, we have explained many times. What are the global, are your legal obligations? What are international obligations for countries who have obligations on climate change but do not meet them? So for example, if you, it is not to ask a question about who is at fault, but is to ask the question, are there any legal responsibilities, and who should be, what are their obligations? That's the question. Early this year, when I addressed an event at the University of Geneva, the question was asked, what if the question is being raised at ICJ now? What if it comes out on the negative side? It doesn't give you any obligations at all. It doesn't say that you have any obligations. And of course, how would I know? I don't know. This is an ICJ question that we put to the court for them to consider. None of us would try to attempt to influence the court in one way or another, unless through the pleadings, your submissions to what you say in the court of law. So I hope that those questions will be raised in December. Submissions have already been made, pleadings have already been made to The Hague, and oral hearings will be done in December. So we hope to see some decision on this coming up in the second quarter of next year. Now, with respect to the climate change, I want to make a reference also to some of the work that's been done by the International Law Commission. One question the Pacific leaders have asked, and which we would like to be related to this question on the ICJ, is the question of continuity of states. What happens if sea level rise due to climate change and our land, especially in the Pacific, where some of our islands, the elevation is about 2-3 meters, and you can see the erosion happening. We see this every day in Vanuatu. I was only back in April, and I cannot believe what I'm seeing. That islands are being eroded, the shores are going inland. So what happens with if you're talking about your boundaries, your sea boundaries, where is your EZ? What is, and the land is being eroded. Where do you start? Where's the baseline that you start from, measuring from here to your EZ? So this question, and what happens if some islands actually disappear, which is a very likelihood of that happening now? What happens? Does the state continue to exist? Yes or no? So it is not only about the ICJ, about our obligations, but also what happens when the worst comes to worst, when islands actually disappear. And we want those questions to be answered for this new international law to apply in these circumstances. So I suppose those of us here, you already know what the ICJ advisory opinion is all about. But what happens after that? If there is a positive reaction to the bleedings that will take place, then there's a next step that will follow on from that. We don't know what that is, but it will be another exercise. But if there is an issue where it is not supported, then what happens to countries? Do they have an obligation at all to do something? The questions we are asking ourselves, the questions that we are putting to the ICJ to address. And I think those of you here in the room will also ask the question yourself. What do we do? What do states do? And then in reference to the International Law Commission, with respect to the work that they do on the continuity of states, what happens to islands disappear altogether? And especially for those of us in the Pacific. We have been very forceful in the Pacific, Vanuatu, but all Pacific Islands speak on this very forcefully. I hope you will support that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ambassador. And then thank you. I think the questions you pointed out, what do we do and what do states do, is in fact highly pertinent, given that we know that in the context of the global community's actions with respect to climate change, one, we are doing not as much as we should be doing. And second, the pace of acceleration of climate change is happening much faster than even the scientists in the IPCC have projected it would be. And so the question of what do we do in a world that is rapidly changing is something that we all have to reflect on. The third speaker will actually be a video presentation from the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development, Professor Surya Deva, who will be, I don't know who will be organizing and then putting the video up on screen. So could you, thank you.
I would like to thank the Center for International Environmental Law for organizing this very timely side event and also inviting me to participate in this through this video. I think this is beyond doubt that climate change impacts all human rights, civil and political human rights, as well as social, economic, and cultural human rights. However, the impact on human rights is not felt by all people and by all countries equally. There's a disproportionate impact on people, for instance, children, women, persons with disability, older persons, indigenous peoples, as well as peasants. They will have disproportionate impact of climate change. Similarly, many countries, especially the least developed countries, as well as SIDS, they will face disproportionate impact. And I think that is where this idea of dual or double disproportionality will become relevant, because if these communities are living in climate vulnerable countries, they will face the exposure of climate change on a double count. Under international human rights law, right to an effective remedy, which is also a human right, is very crucial. But remedies have to be effective. Now, in the context of climate change, what will make the remedies effective? First of all, remedies will be effective if they take cognizance of the historical responsibilities, because climate change has been taken place for decades. And I think that impact and the contribution of those countries and companies that have caused climate change, that disproportionate contribution has to be taken into account. Then the remediation cannot be limited to the borders, because climate change is a global phenomenon and it is impacting people and communities all over the world. At the same time, in my view, we have to look at beyond human beings, because climate change is impacting biodiversity, it is impacting the entire ecosystem and the environment. And of course, we have to see effective remediation in terms of full reparation. That will include restitution, that will include guarantees of non-repetition, and of course, compensation has to be provided. Now, in my report to the General Assembly, which I'll be presenting later this month in New York, I have developed a climate justice framework. In this framework, I have proposed that there should be 4 pillars to be considered. Of course, we talk about mitigation and adaptation all the time, but we don't put enough focus on remediation. So in this climate justice framework, I have talked about that we should see loss and damage and the fund that has been established to address loss and damage as part of remediation. But we also need a 4th pillar, transformation. We need a transformation in terms of the economic order as well as the business models. And of course, we need to reform the international financial architecture, because many countries are facing the debt burden. And to deal with the climate crisis, we have to address the debt crisis as well. In the same report, I also outline 12 overarching human rights principles that should be informing the aspect of climate justice, including remediation. I will not have the time to go through all of these principles, and I will invite the participants to read this report. But let me give a couple of examples of these 12 principles. First is intersectionality. Because the impact of climate change is not experienced by all human beings equally, any remedial approach has to be intersectional to take cognizance of these differences. At the same time, prevention is crucial. So we should not assume that because remediation is possible, we can continue the path of fossil fuel. And I think that is where mitigation is equally important. And we have to phase out the fossil fuel as soon as possible, of course, in line with the just transition principle, and alternatives have to be created. We should also see prevention in terms of providing green technologies, because things that can be prevented, there should be proactive measures taken in this particular context. And of course, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is equally relevant in this particular context. So I very much hope that my report provides guidance to all judicial and non-judicial remedial mechanisms at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level, as well as at the international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that from Professor Defa. With that, I think we can then go to Rina from the OHCHR, who could perhaps elaborate more on the UNSG's analytical study on remedies, and perhaps provide us more information about some of the things that also Professor Surya mentioned. Rina, please.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. I am very grateful to be here on behalf of OHHR's Environment and Climate Change team, alongside esteemed panelists and participants. And as said, I will elaborate on some aspects of the Secretary General's analytical study, which was presented and discussed here at the Council a few weeks ago, especially insofar as it speaks to the right to remedy for climate-related human rights harm. This study was submitted pursuant to Council Resolution 53/6, which requested the Secretary General conduct an analytical study on the impact of loss and damage on human rights, exploring equity-based approaches and solutions to address the same. The study was informed by a wide range of inputs and contributions from across human rights bodies, the UN system, states, a high number of CSOs and others, and of course reflects long-standing efforts by countries and communities on the front lines of the climate crisis as well. Given the urgency of loss and damage as a global justice issue, it's very welcome to see the multiplying work in this space that mandated for the office and for the UN, and also that done by the Special Rapporteur that we just heard about, and many others. In this context, the Secretary General's study has, as mandated, sought to outline the tapestry of rights and equity-based approaches for climate harm, bearing in mind that the real hard work of ensuring that people's rights where they are harmed or subject to effective remedies is being forged already by communities and people on the front lines, often without the direly needed resources and fiscal means for doing so, and remains to be forged and supported further. Now, the study, it firstly describes loss and damage understood in terms of its impacts on human rights. Loss and damage referring generally to harm or adverse impacts of climate change can affect wide range of human rights, also illustrated by the testimonies of states during the interactive dialogue, which described various devastating impacts. The report outlines both economic and non-economic loss and damage impacts on human rights. It underscores the unequal impact of loss and damage on different groups and countries, noting, as stressed by the High Commissioner, that countries that benefited the least from the Industrial Revolution have been left without the support necessary to protect their people and environments. The report then outlines legal and policy frameworks for addressing the impact of loss and damage on human rights. In this context, it stresses that the right to an effective remedy is a fundamental principle of international human rights law, and that remedies should be available and accessible to all people for human rights violations resulting from loss and damage. It emphasizes a holistic approach, stating that remedies and reparatory justice require a comprehensive and multi-pronged approach grounded in international human rights law, including, where appropriate, as stated by Professor, the right to reparation, including restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. As such, remedies can serve to address not only past harm, but also play a preventive role in terms of mitigation and adaptation to avert and minimize loss and damage. A remedy approach can also reinforce the accountability of states, businesses, and others for their contributions to climate change. According to OHHR, the obligations of states in the context of climate change extend to all rights holders and to harm that occurs both inside and beyond boundaries. Because long-term global warming is closely proportional to cumulative emissions, the study notes that historical emission source attribution is critical to the overall attribution of responsibilities for climate impacts. From 1850 to 2002, industrialized countries produced, for instance, 3 times the carbon dioxide produced by the entire global south. The study states that under human rights law, those responsible for climate change are accountable for compensatory measures, including financial, for harm incurred. It also emphasizes that there's a moral rationale and legal basis for holding fossil fuel companies accountable for climate harm and reparations. The study then proceeds to outline human rights and equity-based approaches to addressing loss and damage, which are seen as mutually reinforcing. In terms of the first of these, which looks at human rights-based approaches, the study notes that the creation of equity-based mechanisms and initiatives under relevant UN entities to assess, value, and quantify, as well as compensate for loss and damage, including human rights impacts, should be explored. In this context, such assessments should be rights-based, needs-based, and community-led, while addressing, for instance, structural and historical inequalities and discrimination in remedies and valuation. The section on climate resilience and social protection measures notes that addressing loss and damage in a way that advances climate justice requires wide-ranging remedies for the root causes of climate change, including its structural, temporal, collective, and transboundary dimensions. And another recommendation in this section is that developed countries should support the efforts of developing countries to increase investment in social protection systems. And in this regard, also ILO's very recent work on climate change and social protection is worth exploring. On finance, the study states that financing needs to be scaled up urgently, including to address loss and damage through effective remedies, particularly compensation, and that presently developing countries together, excluding China, are estimated to require at least 2.4 trillion annually for climate finance, including adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage, which is the same amount as the global military expenditure in 2023. The study notes that under human rights law, harm reducing and remedial action must be adequately financed, and that funding to compensate for loss and damage should come primarily from developed countries and those most responsible for climate change, in line with the principles of equity, polluter pays, and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. It further states that developed countries should also consider mobilizing financing through novel sources such as equity-based taxation. And some remedies might also be ineffective as long as debt distress and the loan-based economic climate finance model persist as in the current form. And according to the study, equitable debt restructuring and debt cancellation coupled with grant-based loss and damage funding should be promoted. The part on climate justice and transitional justice approaches speaks about the elaboration of climate reparations on a systemic and historic scale, noting that diverse forms of reparation guarantees of non-recurrence and truth-seeking could also redress holistically the non-economic dimensions of loss and damage that other approaches may inadequately address. And in this regard, the Secretary General in the recommendations has encouraged, among other things, states to consider establishing a group of experts or other mechanism on climate justice to explore human rights and equity-based approaches to climate harm, including loss and damage and associated human rights dimensions. The Secretary General makes a number of further specific conclusions and recommendations at the end of the report, which we invite you to further consider. And I will end here. Looking forward to discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for that, Rina, and for pointing us towards the SG's report. I would encourage all of you, all of us actually, to read it. It makes for very interesting reading, and it could be one of those reports that might be useful for the OHCHR, for example, to consider putting into the UNFCCC process, given that we will be discussing how to enhance the work on loss and damage that are being undertaken in that process. With that, then let me turn to Lien, please, who will be giving us some ideas on pathways to advance effective remedies for climate harm. Lien, please.
Thank you, moderator, and thanks everyone for the interesting presentation so far, which have already set the context quite clear that the human rights, the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and those that are affected by that crisis have a right to remedy. And importantly, related state obligations are found under existing law, and so accountability for climate harm does not require the development of new norms, but the application of existing ones. And that's important to keep in mind when looking at mechanisms, in particular under the climate governance regime, which so far has failed to uphold the right to remedy for climate harm, where we've seen decades of denial to address loss and damage, and reliance on voluntary approaches, also persistent attempts to circumvent and avoid liability for climate harm, which has led to a prevention of actual progress on addressing loss and damage or climate harm under the UNFCCC. And even the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27, which was a historical decision and really important, but even that doesn't change that reality. And the brilliant study that Rina just described of the UN Secretary General actually confirms that loss and damage mechanisms under the UNFCCC are currently not designed to uphold the right to remedy in the context of climate harm. So that means that these mechanisms should be restructured to align them more explicitly with human rights obligations, human rights standards, and principles, to make sure that they can actually contribute to the state obligations to uphold the right to remedy in the context of climate harm. But even with such changes, if we would do that, complementary approaches will be needed given the scale of the harm and the wide variety of harms that we are seeing in the context of the climate crisis. So in that context, when thinking of these complementary approaches, the right to remedy is critical from a practical and a legal perspective. As Professor Deva mentioned, there's different aspects of substantive redress. So the right to remedy, upholding the right to remedy entails access to justice, and it entails substantive redress. And substantive redress, there are a variety of means to realize substantive redress. We're talking about restitution, we're talking about compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and also guarantees of non-repetition, which all contribute to substantive redress and can be used in together to make sure that redress is actually realized. So given the variety and the large scale of the harm that we're seeing in the context of the climate crisis, which are both moral and material, in the context of the UNFCCC, we're often talking about economic and non-economic. It's really crucial to look at the right to remedy and the extensive jurisprudence and practical application of the right to remedy to really address climate harm comprehensively. And I think Ray's presentation also clarifies that it's really critical to take a comprehensive approach to reparations in the context of climate harm and look at the variety of factors that have contributed to this harm. So the climate crisis is unique in nature, in scope, in the severity of the impact, but it is unfortunately not the first time that humanity has dealt with large-scale human rights harm. And so existing national, regional, and international mechanisms that have been established to provide reparations can actually provide precedents, can provide lessons learned to understand how we can deal with climate harm and how programs to deal with climate harm can be designed. And as you can see, there's a QR code on the screen to subscribe to a report that is going to be published in the coming weeks that we worked on at CIAL, where we're bringing all of this together, what's been discussed at this panel, but also where we worked with with researchers and based on extensive academic research on reparations mechanisms to look at what can be learned from that to guide the establishment of climate reparation programs. And based on that research, we've identified 6 principles that that should be considered when developing climate reparations mechanisms. At a minimum, all climate reparations mechanisms will be context specific and will have to be developed, of course, based on the specific harm that we're looking at, together with the victims that are seeking justice. But those principles really should be taken into account as a minimum. And as Professor Deva, I don't have time to go into the different principles, but I'll list them. They're victim-centric, inclusive and comprehensive, intersectional as well, adequate and accessible, accountable for causally linked harm, and trackable and adaptable. And if you want to read more about what that means in practice for climate reparations programs, I invite you to subscribe to the report, and you can read more about that once it's published. What we want to do with this report is, of course, contribute to the legal, the clarity on the legal obligations on addressing climate harm, repairing climate harm, but also really contribute to the practical thinking and also to breaking the taboo around climate reparations, around this taboo that we've seen in the UNFCCC, mainly in the climate negotiations, where we see more and more in the context of the human rights world, human rights mechanisms, human rights institutions, that that taboo is being broken because there are pre-existing legal obligations. There is, of course, there's human rights obligations in the context of climate harm that apply, regardless of what is happening under the UN climate negotiations. I'm not sure how much time I still have. Oh, I still have a little bit of time. Yeah. So I'll just, what we also describe in the report, and what is really important, is that human rights institutions are increasingly contributing to progress on advancing a remedy for climate harm. We've seen that on this panel, of course, but also human rights treaty bodies have in recent communications, for example, the Human Rights Committee on the Torres Strait Islanders case has clarified or has ruled that compensation was needed for harm that was the climate harm that took place. And also the Committee of the Rights of the Child in its recent general comment on child's rights and the climate crisis has clarified that there is that the right to remedy is closely linked to climate harm. And these legal advancements are really important in the context of also these political solutions that we're discussing. And so we really invite human rights mechanisms to do more, because we see a lot of advancements, but much more can be done to really inform both litigated and political solutions to climate harm and to loss and damage. So I'll end there. Maybe also just one more note on, of course, we are also looking at very eagerly at the International Court of Justice advisory opinion to also contribute to that debate, again, from a political and a legal perspective. Yeah, you can subscribe to the report, but you can also find the key messages of our report already printed out at the back of this room if you would like to read more. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Lian. And maybe with that, noting the time, let me open the floor up for questions. You can direct your question to any member of the panel. Please identify yourself as well when you do raise questions. So I'm just scanning the room now to see whose flag will be raised first, or whose hand will be raised first. And while I'm looking around the room, maybe let me then take, my privilege as a moderator to maybe pose a couple of questions as well to the panel, and whoever wants to respond to this would be useful. In the climate process, we will be having a review of the loss and damage institutions that we have built up over the past 15 years. That review will take place this November. In Baku. And so one question I would have is, would you have any suggestions that you would want to bring to the climate change process in terms of how we can bring about a greater level of coordination between the human rights mechanisms and the climate change policy mechanisms and other institutions that are dealing with loss and damage? And the second question, which I hope at least someone in the panel will respond to, maybe drawing from the SG's report as well, is what measures do we need to have or to undertake to shift the conversation along two temporal timeframes? One, in terms of current challenges. We know those challenges are inequality, we have near-term impacts, extreme weather events, slow onset events. So what kind of immediate near-term cooperation mechanisms can we develop as a global community? And second, what about future challenges? What do we do, as Ambassador Antas was saying? What do we do? We know for it's almost a certainty now that we are facing a 1.5-degree world already within our lifetimes. It is almost sure that by the end of this century, we might actually be getting to 2 degrees. So what do we do with that kind of world? And how do we create the cooperation mechanisms, remediation, and all of those other things to prepare the world, global community, our poor and vulnerable peoples and populations for that kind of world? Yes, over there in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Suarez Franco from PN International. I have a comment and a question. The comment is regarding the holistic character of climate change, in which, as we heard in the first intervention, we do not only have states who are responsible for the harm produced, but also companies. And it's clear that this is connected to the global value chains, which means just taking one sector wouldn't be helpful. And maybe we need to cover many different industrial sectors. And that's why civil society 10 years ago pushed for the process towards a treaty on transnational corporations and other business enterprises with regard for human rights. Unfortunately, the session, it seems to be that will be postponed. And also, unfortunately, the mention to the right to healthy environment disappeared from the from the last draft, even that has not been requested by any states in the negotiations. And in this sense, I think I want to call the civil society here and the states here to really reaffirm the importance of this process in connection with the climate issues, because we have their proposals on liability beyond borders. And the second question is regarding the main issue tackled by the ambassador regarding what are we going to do with the people that lose their land or the states that disappear. I think at the national level, we for sure will need ecological agrarian reforms. But then the question for the other panelists would be, how do you say that states should comply with their obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to land, when the states disappear? Where are we going to give land to these people so that they continue with their life and their livelihoods? Which process do we need? This is my very easy question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ana Maria. Thank you very much. Very easy indeed. And I'm sure the easiness of those questions will be easily answered by our panel. I have Marshall Islands, and maybe I can take 1 or 2 more before we turn it back to our panel. Let me just scan the room and see if there are any other flags up. Yes, over there in the back. So Marshall Islands and then gentleman in the back, and then I'll turn it back to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for everybody for this event and for the organization. I'll be very quick because it's not an urgent filling with questions. I'm just going to throw here a series of information for all those that are interested, that in terms of steps also that were taken in addition to what Ambassador Sumbu mentioned with the ICJ, there was also a Pacific Island Forum declaration on statehood and people affected by sea level rise. And in New York during UNGA, there was also a declaration from the leader of the AOSIS, so that's the Alliance of Small Island Developing States, that are trying to address some of those points. And so I want you to look at these declarations that can indicate what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And sir, in the back.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Vinod Kottari, human rights scholar activist. I wanted to just bring in some information from work being done in other sectors, and want to ask panelists, thank you very much for presentations on what is the state of the work on impact assessments. It's quite clear that we cannot really get to loss and damage, as we know, with the droughts, floods coming, what the impact assessment would be. And there's been quite a lot of work done on this in the work on this development-based displacement, so on creation impact assessment, social impact assessment. So my question was on what is the state of the art on impact assessment related to that.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Professor Milun. So let me turn it back to the panel. Let's go first to our frontline defender, Ray, and then working back through the panel. Ray, please.
Thank you so much for the question. And I will just make a general response to some of the questions or comments that was raised. For the first one, I mean, the Banabans are still trying to figure out what is state obligation when it comes to trying to redress many of the historical issues that happen. And I totally agree that it's not just the state that have a lot of responsibilities in this, but also the companies that are engaging, especially the semiconductor companies that are engaging, because the need for minerals in whatever form it is going to continue to be a demand globally. Our question would be maybe how do we address the past issues to redress so many of the issues and to trace back to our ancestral land where it went to and what it did to the countries it went to. How do we then account for that? And I think it's still something it's our first time engaging the UN processes now, so it's a bit too early for us. Although we've been talking about these things and studying and trying to do a lot of research into tracing our land, where it went to, what do we get for justice to bring back our land? Because in our case, the 22 million tons of land have disappeared and we've managed to trace them, but we cannot get justice for part of us that left our island.
Thank you, Ray. Ambassador Antas?
I don't have any magic solutions. The questions being asked, it's not to be asked to the panelists. It is to be asked to all of us. And I keep coming back. The question of addressing what we're talking about is all of us our responsibilities. But let me just say very quickly, because even in Vanuatu, we are also looking at ongoing work in addition to the ICJ advisory opinion, is also to look at the question of ecocide, as well as the non-proliferation of fossil fuels, is something that we think we should also address. So the question is, how can we address all this in a holistic fashion? But I think it's so complex. We have to put them in silos and address them bits and pieces. But at the end of the day, it's a big question that we have to ask ourselves. The solution is to put them in silos and try and address them slowly but surely. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 1 minute left. Maybe half a minute for Rina and Lian, and then we'll close.
Thank you. Just very quickly, on the questions relating to land, for example, and these aspects that a report elaborates on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas, and the provisions these contain, for instance, in relation to remedies. So that's worth maybe looking at. And then in terms of assessment of loss and damage, the report notes that knowledge regarding human rights aspects of and approaches to loss and damage remains quite scarce and fragmented at the moment. So certainly more needs to be done in this space. It also has some recommendations relating to, for instance, sea level rise and also state with territorial and maritime entitlements. That's pointed to by the ambassador as well. So I encourage you to look at it further. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. Yeah.
Yeah, very quickly, I'll come back to your question on coordination. I mean, there's no time to elaborate, but I do think that one of the critical issues is that the UN climate negotiations and the human rights spaces are quite far away from each other, and there is not a lot of well, in the UN climate negotiations, human rights obligations are not enough integrated. So definitely interested to look at the WIM review to, to make sure that human rights institutions can feed more into the process. And I'm happy to speak with any state in the room who would like to explore that further. And then maybe on the question of corporations, just generally, of course, the states also have the obligation to regulate corporations and to make sure that they assume the costs of the reparations of the harm that they have caused. In that context, the polluter pays principle is critical, and yeah, there's much more that can be said about that, but it's definitely a really critical consideration as well. Thanks.
Thank you. So with that, we're right on the mark at 3 o'clock. Let me thank all of you for being here. And also on behalf of all of us, let me apologize to the next group that will be using the room for taking a few seconds of their time. Again, thank you very much, everyone.